In the aftermath of slavery, when freedom was new but opportunity was scarce, a powerful force began to rise from within the heart of the African American community, the Black Church. It was more than a place of worship. It was a sanctuary of learning, dignity, and hope for newly freed men and women who had been denied education for generations. The church became the first classroom, the first library, and the first beacon of knowledge. Within wooden walls lit by candlelight, preachers became teachers, and sermons often ended with lessons on reading, writing, and understanding the world beyond survival. These early church schools were small, humble, and often hidden from those who disapproved of black progress, yet they carried an enormous purpose. Children learned their first letters from chalk on slate, while adults practiced their signatures, dreaming of the day they could read the Bible or a newspaper on their own. Every word learned was an act of empowerment. Every lesson a quiet declaration that freedom meant more than the absence of chains. It meant the power to think, to choose, and to lead. Soon, the mission grew larger. Churches began training teachers and leaders, laying the foundation for institutions that would shape future generations. From these sacred spaces emerged the minds that would one day challenge injustice, organize communities, and transform society. Education became a form of resistance, and the Black Church became its beating heart. This story is not just about buildings or sermons, it is about a people who turned faith into progress and struggle into strength. Their legacy still echoes in classrooms, communities, and movements across the world today. If you believe in stories of courage, unity, and transformation, stories that remind us how far humanity can rise through faith and learning, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support helps us bring forgotten chapters of history back to life and keep the spirit of knowledge and justice alive for future generations. As the first schools began to grow within the walls of the Black Church, something even deeper was taking shape, a sense of community unlike anything the country had seen before. Knowledge brought power, but unity brought survival. The same buildings where people learned to read also became places where they could breathe freely, speak their truth, and find shelter from a world that often refused to see their humanity. Outside, signs and laws divided people by color. Inside, the church reminded them they were part of one family, bound by faith, struggle, and an unbreakable hope for tomorrow. When storms of hate swept through towns and fear crept into every home, the church stood like a fortress of compassion. It was where mothers brought their children when they were afraid, where fathers planned how to keep their families safe, and where young men and women found the courage to believe that peace was still possible. Every hymn sung together was more than worship, it was an act of defiance against despair. Each prayer was a promise whispered into the darkness that no amount of cruelty could extinguish their light. In those, gathering together was more than social or spiritual. It was survival. The church became the heart of every black neighborhood, a place to mourn, to celebrate, and to rebuild. It was where news traveled fastest, where plans were made, and where people learned how to navigate a world designed to silence them. While the outside world often treated them as invisible, within the church they were seen, valued, and loved. The pulpit became both altar and podium, a place where words could heal, inspire, and organize. Ministers were more than preachers. They were messengers, strategists, and protectors. They guided their congregations through danger, sometimes with coded messages woven into their sermons. Under the watchful eyes of the powerful, faith meetings often carried hidden purposes, plans for safety, education, or quiet protest. In the glow of lanterns, elders shared wisdom about endurance, and young people were reminded that they were part of something larger than themselves. These gatherings were where collective strength was born, the kind of strength that could face injustice not with bitterness, but with courage shaped by hope. The walls of the church heard everything: laughter from weddings, tears from funerals, the anxious whispers of parents praying for their children's future. Every event was part of a larger rhythm, one that kept the spirit of the people alive through times of despair and danger. Even in moments of great fear, there was music, gospel songs rising like a shield, words of faith turning pain into perseverance. Those melodies carried the people through the darkest nights, giving them a language of endurance when words failed. As time moved on, these sacred spaces began to evolve into community hubs. They hosted secret meetings for organizing boycotts and rallies, supported families who had lost loved ones, and helped new generations discover their voices. In basements and side rooms, volunteers gathered food for the hungry, sewed clothes for the poor, and taught one another the skills to survive and thrive. The church was never just about worship. It was about building a foundation for life: spiritual, social, and political. In every corner of America, wherever there was hardship, there was also a church that stood as a symbol of unity. Even in the smallest towns, the ringing of the church bell meant safety, connection, and belonging. It called people home, not only to faith but to fellowship. That sense of belonging gave birth to something extraordinary: a belief that, despite everything, change was possible if they stood together. Generations later, historians would call these churches the backbone of the civil rights movement. But for the people living through it, they were simply home. Home to ideas that would transform nations. Home to the first whispers of dreams that would one day be spoken on the steps of monuments. Home to the quiet determination that freedom was not just a dream but a destiny waiting to be fulfilled. Within their walls, faith was no longer only a personal salvation, it was a collective mission. Every gathering reminded people that unity could overcome division, that love could stand firm where hatred sought to destroy. The sermons spoke not just of heaven, but of justice on earth, and the congregations carried that message beyond the sanctuary into the streets, schools, and workplaces. The story of the Black Church is not one of buildings or rituals alone, but of hearts bound together in courage. It is the story of people who built sanctuaries from the ashes of oppression, who turned their pain into power, and their faith into movement. In the quiet strength of those gatherings lay the blueprint for resistance, a reminder that even when the world is divided, unity born from compassion can rebuild it again. From the earliest days after emancipation to the height of social transformation, the church remained the beating heart of the community, its doors open to everyone: the weary, the hopeful, the determined, and its message was clear. Together, we endure. Together, we rise. As the Black Church continued to grow as a sanctuary of learning and unity, its purpose began to expand far beyond the spiritual. Within its walls, faith evolved into action. The same pulpits that once echoed with hymns and prayers now became platforms for awakening, for planning, for the birth of leadership. The people who had gathered for strength in times of fear were now learning how to shape their destiny. What began as places of worship and refuge transformed into training grounds for change, where ordinary men and women discovered the extraordinary power of their voices. Ministers who once spoke only of salvation began to preach about freedom in this world as well. They reminded their congregations that faith without action was incomplete, and that true belief demanded courage in the face of injustice. Week after week, church meetings shifted from simple gatherings to sessions of preparation. Members learned how to speak with conviction, how to write letters to city councils, how to challenge unfair laws peacefully yet persistently. The sanctuary became a classroom once again, not for reading and writing this time, but for learning how to stand, how to lead, and how to claim a rightful place in a nation that had long denied it. In every community, there were young people watching, listening, and finding their purpose. They saw pastors who refused to be silent and elders who guided with wisdom and patience. They learned how to organize without anger and how to resist without violence. The church taught them discipline, strategy, and the importance of unity. Plans for voter registration drives were discussed after Sunday services, when pews emptied and whispers of determination filled the air. Flyers were printed in church basements, and phone calls were made from parish offices, spreading messages of hope disguised as simple invitations. Each effort carried risk, yet the people pressed forward because they believed that their faith demanded more than prayer, it demanded participation. Those who gathered in the church knew that voting was not just a political act. It was a declaration of existence. It was the right to speak, to decide, to belong. Many who joined registration drives faced intimidation or worse, but the church gave them courage that no threat could extinguish. Before each campaign, pastors would lead the congregation in prayer not only for safety but for wisdom and endurance. The songs sung before those journeys were hymns of purpose, the same melodies that had carried their ancestors through trials long before. Each note, each word, reminded them that progress was built one brave step at a time. As the movement for justice grew louder across the country, these church-trained organizers became its heartbeat. They were not politicians by title, yet they understood leadership in its truest form: service to others. They carried clipboards instead of banners, Bibles alongside pamphlets, and spoke in the language of faith, equality, and shared humanity. Many of the great figures who would later lead national movements first stood at church podiums as teenagers, reading announcements or leading youth groups. There, they learned how to speak to a crowd, how to inspire without anger, and how to turn faith into force. Behind every public speech, there were countless quiet meetings held in church halls lit by flickering lights. Teachers, laborers, and preachers gathered together to map out strategies for change. The pews that had once held Sunday worshippers became seats for community organizers. There were no grand resources, only conviction and the unshakable belief that justice was within reach. And from those gatherings rose movements that would transform the country. The civil rights movement did not begin in grand offices or political headquarters. It began in the humble sanctuaries where people sang and prayed, where belief became action. The church also provided something the outside world could not trust. It was one of the few places where people could speak freely, share ideas, and disagree without division. That trust made it possible to coordinate complex efforts across states and towns. Word of upcoming marches or legal challenges traveled through a network of pastors and congregations, creating an invisible thread that connected entire communities. This spiritual and social web became the backbone of the early Black political awakening, a structure built not with wealth but with faith, discipline, and love. Through these efforts, generations of Black leaders were born. They were taught that leadership was not about power, but about responsibility. The pulpit trained them to speak truth with compassion. The choir taught them harmony, not only in song but in purpose. The congregation showed them the strength of standing together. Each leader who emerged carried with them the lessons learned under the stained glass windows and wooden ceilings of their local church. They understood that progress came not from anger but from organization, and that justice required both patience and persistence. The legacy of this movement endures because it was built on faith that had already survived centuries of trials. The church taught its people to lift their eyes toward heaven while keeping their feet firmly planted in the work of the earth. It reminded them that freedom is both a gift and a duty, something to be protected, expanded, and shared. Through songs, sermons, and quiet acts of service, the Black church became a living school of democracy, where every believer was a student of change and every prayer a step toward a more equal world. What began as a refuge became a revolution of the spirit, a movement not born in anger, but in the steady conviction that love and justice are inseparable. The people who once gathered in those sanctuaries to learn to read now gathered to learn to lead, proving that when faith and purpose unite, even the smallest voices can echo across history. As the movement for justice gathered strength, the heart of its organization pulsed not in political offices or grand halls, but beneath the humble wooden floors of churches across the South, in those quiet, dimly lit basements where faith had long been nurtured. A new kind of power began to take shape, the power of collective purpose. Folding chairs and chalkboards replaced pews, and the air once filled with hymns now carried the hum of strategy and determination. These spaces, built for prayer and fellowship, became the nerve centers of a national transformation. There, people who had once been silenced learned how to raise their voices with courage and wisdom. The church basements were more than rooms. They were laboratories of hope. Men and women of every age gathered after long workdays, some still wearing the dust of factories or fields, to plan how they could confront a system that denied them dignity. Ministers opened their doors knowing the risk it carried. They understood that change often began in secret, in whispers, in the gathering of ordinary people who refused to believe that injustice was permanent. Pastors stood at the center of it all, shepherds guiding not only spiritual lives, but the direction of an entire generation. Among these leaders stood Martin Luther King Jr., a young pastor from Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. To many, he was simply a preacher, a man known for his eloquence and deep faith. Yet within the sacred walls of his church, his message grew beyond sermons. His pulpit became a platform for action, his congregation a training ground for nonviolent resistance. Meetings were held late into the night, with strategies drawn on blackboards, maps marked with routes of marchers, and lists of volunteers who were willing to risk their freedom for the promise of equality. What happened in those church basements was nothing short of revolutionary. It was there that the Montgomery bus boycott found its strength, where communities planned sit-ins and voter registration drives, and where the philosophy of peaceful protest was refined into a disciplined art. The church gave the movement not only a place to meet, but a moral compass. Every plan began and ended with prayer, reminding those involved that their mission was not born from hatred, but from the conviction that love and justice could rebuild a broken world. When the time came to march, the church bells were the first to ring. People filed out of the basements and sanctuaries into the streets, their hearts fortified by the songs they had sung together the night before. Pastors led from the front, holding Bibles in their hands, standing shoulder to shoulder with students, mothers, and elders. These were not professional politicians or soldiers. They were people of faith, guided by a belief that the soul of a nation could be redeemed through courage and compassion. The beauty of this movement was in its humanity. Each protest, each march, was prepared with the care of a sacred ritual. Those who participated were taught how to remain calm in the face of provocation, how to protect one another, and how to maintain the dignity that their oppressors sought to deny. They prayed together, sang together, and stood together, turning ordinary acts into symbols of extraordinary strength. And behind every public act of defiance was a hidden world of organization, handwritten notes, whispered plans, and late-night gatherings in the safety of church basements. The sanctuaries that had once sheltered the fearful now birthed the fearless. Pastors like King, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and countless others carried the responsibility of leading both spiritually and strategically. They drew from Scripture to remind people that justice was not a dream but a divine calling. The Bible's message of deliverance became intertwined with the struggle for civil rights, its verses echoing not just in Sunday sermons but in the chants of marchers across the nation. In this way, faith and activism became inseparable, two sides of the same mission to restore human dignity. The atmosphere in those meetings was electric yet reverent. People spoke in hushed voices, aware of the dangers that surrounded them, but their resolve only deepened. They knew that what they were building was fragile and dangerous, but also sacred. The walls of those basements absorbed the sound of strategy, laughter, fear, and determination, the heartbeat of a movement that would change history. Over time, the stories of those nights became legend. The plans forged in secret became the marches that the world would one day witness. Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma, and beyond. The power that began beneath the floorboards of small churches spread to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where J. King's voice carried the hopes of millions. When he spoke of his dream, he was not merely speaking for himself, but for every person who had gathered in those quiet rooms, every soul who had risked everything for the belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Even after the marches ended and the laws began to change, the legacy of those church basements endured. They stood as reminders that faith could move more than mountains, it could move nations. The pastors who once preached to congregations of hundreds had inspired millions, not through wealth or power, but through conviction, humility, and courage. Their work proved that leadership rooted in compassion can awaken the conscience of an entire people. The story of those churches, of their basements filled with purpose, is a story of transformation, how faith became action, how unity became strength, and how hope became history. What began as whispers beneath the sound of church bells became the voice of a generation, rising from the depths of sanctuaries into the open air of freedom. As the movement grew stronger, so did the weight of opposition. Marches were met with hostility, and calls for equality were often drowned out by threats and violence. Yet through all of it, the people who gathered in churches across the South refused to answer hatred with hatred. They had learned a different way, one rooted not in anger, but in faith. From the pulpit to the pew, from prayer meetings to planning sessions, the church spiritual teachings became the moral foundation upon which the movement stood. It was there that people learned that love, when guided by principle, could become a weapon more powerful than any force of cruelty. Each sermon carried more than the rhythm of Scripture. It carried lessons in endurance. Ministers reminded their congregations that faith was not only a belief but a discipline. They spoke of forgiveness not as surrender, but as strength. They drew upon the ancient stories of endurance of Moses, of David, of those who had faced impossible odds and still chosen righteousness over revenge. For many who sat in the wooden pews listening, these were not distant parables. They were mirrors of their own lives. When the outside world told them they were powerless, the church reminded them that they were heirs of a spiritual legacy stronger than fear. In the face of danger, prayer became a shield. Before every march, crowds would gather in sanctuaries to bow their heads together. The air was heavy with both fear and resolve. People prayed for protection, but also for restraint, for the ability to remain peaceful even when provoked. It was in those moments that faith revealed its truest power, not in miracles of escape, but in the quiet miracle of courage. Songs rose like waves, filling every corner of the room. We shall overcome. Those words were not just lyrics. They were a promise shared between generations, a declaration that the soul of a people could not be broken. What the church gave the movement was not only strategy or organization, but a moral compass that pointed always toward compassion. It taught that justice was hollow without mercy, that victory was empty if it came at the cost of another's humanity. Nonviolence was not weakness, it was a deliberate, disciplined act of faith. To stand unarmed before hostility, to endure insult without retaliation, required a strength that few could understand. Yet it was this very strength that captured the conscience of the world. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. often spoke of love as a redemptive force, not sentimental love, but the kind that demanded courage and sacrifice. In his sermons, he urged his followers to see even their adversaries as souls capable of change. This was not an easy teaching to live by. Many who listened had suffered deeply. They carried scars both visible and unseen. Still, they chose to walk the path of peace, because the church had taught them that hatred multiplies suffering, but compassion can transform it. Inside the sanctuaries, the atmosphere was one of determination wrapped in grace. People knelt beside one another, the elderly, the young, the weary, all bound by a shared purpose. They drew strength not from weapons or numbers, but from conviction. When they left those buildings and stepped into the streets, they carried that spiritual armor with them. In the face of taunts and blows, they held to their faith as firmly as to their signs and banners. Their calm unsettled those who opposed them, because it revealed a truth that could not be silenced. Peace, when chosen freely, is stronger than fear. In the movement's darkest hours, when arrests and loss weighed heavily, the church remained a sanctuary of the spirit. Ministers visited prisons, led vigils, and comforted families. They reminded the people that suffering was not defeat, but part of a larger story, one of redemption and renewal. Each time despair threatened to take hold, someone would begin to sing, and voices would join until hope filled the air again. These gatherings were more than meetings. They were acts of healing. They reminded everyone that even in pain, there was purpose, and in endurance, there was triumph. Through these teachings, the church shaped not only the movement's philosophy but also its identity. It taught that dignity was not granted by laws or systems, but by the unwavering belief in one's own worth. That belief became contagious, spreading from the pews to the streets, from one generation to the next. Faith turned fear into focus and suffering into strength. Even those who were not religious could feel the power of that collective spirit, a force that seemed to rise from the ground itself, lifting people beyond despair. The beauty of the movement's nonviolence lay in its moral clarity. It did not seek revenge or dominance. It sought understanding and reconciliation. Every act of restraint became a testimony, every peaceful march a sermon in motion. The world watched as ordinary people, teachers, farmers, laborers, students stood with quiet dignity against oppression. Their courage challenged hearts and minds across the globe, showing that true strength is not found in the hand that strikes, but in the heart that endures. When history remembers the movement, it often speaks of laws changed and barriers broken. But beneath those victories was something less visible and more enduring: the spiritual fire that burned in every song, every prayer, every act of compassion. That fire was kindled in the churches, fed by Scripture, sustained by faith. It gave the people not just a cause to fight for, but a reason to believe that goodness would prevail. And so, even when nights grew long and victory seemed distant, they returned to the sanctuaries that had birthed their courage. There, surrounded by familiar hymns and the warmth of community, they found renewal. The church reminded them that justice rooted in love could never be destroyed. It was this belief, steady, humble, and radiant, that carried the movement forward and continues to illuminate the path toward a more compassionate world. While faith gave the movement its soul, organization gave it motion, and the Black Church became the heartbeat of that momentum. Within its walls, news spread faster than any printed paper, carried not by machines but by voices full of conviction. A sermon on Sunday could spark a march by Monday. Announcements were woven into prayers, and plans for freedom were shared between verses of hymns. Each gathering was both a spiritual service and a strategy meeting. Though it never felt that way to those inside, it felt like purpose taking shape, as faith transformed into coordinated action. Pastors became not only preachers but also messengers, relaying information from one community to another with remarkable efficiency. They traveled between towns under the guise of church duties, carrying letters, lists, and instructions hidden among their sermon notes. Congregants listened closely, knowing that every word carried meaning beyond the surface. When a pastor said, "Be ready for Monday," it was understood that change was coming. This unspoken code, a language of faith and action, allowed communication to flow safely and swiftly even under constant watch. The church's rhythm of weekly meetings became an invisible network. Core practices turned into organizing sessions. Bible study groups became circles of strategy. While the songs filled the air with harmony, hands beneath the pews exchanged flyers, names, and ideas. The beauty of it all was that the movement did not need grand offices or official bulletins. It had the trust of the people, built over generations of shared struggle and prayer. When the church spoke, the community listened, not because they were commanded to, but because they believed in the integrity of the voices leading them. Many of the movement's most pivotal moments began in such gatherings. Plans for marches, sit-ins, and voter registration drives were whispered over potluck dinners after evening service. Elders offered wisdom, young people volunteered energy, and the entire congregation formed a living network of courage. It was through this method, through sermons that stirred hearts and meetings that clarified purpose, that large groups were mobilized almost overnight. In a world without social media or instant communication, it was astonishing how quickly people could unite around a single call to action. But it was not just speed that made the church's communication so powerful. It was the sense of trust and unity it inspired. Information shared from the pulpit carried moral weight. When a minister spoke of a coming protest, it was framed not as rebellion but as an act of faith, a duty to live out the values of love and justice preached every week. This framing mattered deeply. It turned participation from a risky act of defiance into a sacred responsibility. The people were not merely following instructions. They were answering a divine call to stand for what was right. In those, word of mouth became a sacred thread connecting towns and generations. Young messengers carried notes hidden in Bibles or hymnals, traveling between churches under the cover of ordinary visits. A Sunday gathering in Montgomery could set off a chain of meetings across Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi within days. The network worked because it was built on relationships, on the shared belief that each person was part of something far greater than themselves. The spirit that bound them together was stronger than fear, stronger even than the forces trying to silence them. Inside the sanctuaries, the atmosphere often crackled with anticipation. People would file in quietly, dressed in their best clothes, their faces calm but their hearts restless. Once the doors closed and the singing began, a sense of power filled the room, the kind born from unity. The preacher's words might begin with a passage from Scripture, but soon they would shift into something more immediate. News of an upcoming rally, a reminder of who had been arrested, instructions on where to gather next. Every announcement carried risk, yet it was always delivered with unwavering calm, as though God Himself had already ordained the next step. After the benediction, groups would linger in small circles, voices hushed but determined. Plans were refined, volunteers chosen, supplies gathered. Women from the congregation prepared meals for those who would travel. Men offered their cars for transport. Young students took notes on directions and times. Within hours, a web of coordination stretched across entire counties. No single person controlled it. The strength came from collective purpose, each church acting as both a lighthouse and a lifeline. These efforts often went unnoticed by those outside the movement, who could not see how deeply faith and logistics intertwined. The hymns that rose from church windows were not only expressions of worship, but signals of readiness. This little light of mine was more than a song, it was a declaration that each person's courage could light the darkness around them. Even the act of gathering itself was a statement of unity, a reminder that communication built on faith could move mountains more effectively than any machine or message ever could. As the movement gained momentum, the church network expanded beyond its walls. Messages reached barbershops, schools, and community centers, each place echoing the same message of hope and paration. And still, it all returned to the sanctuary, the safe space where information met inspiration, and plans met prayer. It was there that people could speak freely, sing, and then rise renewed with a clear sense of purpose. The miracle of those times was not only that information moved swiftly, but that it moved with integrity. Every message carried compassion. Every plan was rooted in the belief that justice must be pursued with dignity. The church became a living instrument of organization guided not by hierarchy or command, but by faith and the unshakable trust of its people. Looking back, it is easy to see how these gatherings became the quiet engine of change. The walls that once echoed with hymns of hope also echoed with strategy and solidarity. Faith and communication, spirit and action, they blended seamlessly, proving that a message carried in love can travel faster, last longer, and inspire deeper than any shout of anger ever could. Through the church, an entire people learned to move as one, not through orders, but through shared belief, and in doing so, they transformed the very rhythm of history itself. While sermons stirred the heart and meetings united the people, it was generosity that kept the movement alive. Behind every march, every courtroom battle, and every weary bus ride stood congregations who understood that freedom came at a price, and they were willing to pay it together. The Black Church was not rich in gold or property, but it was rich in faith, discipline, and the unshakable belief that what they built together could not be broken. Week after week, small donations filled offering plates. A few coins from a maid's wages, $1 from a factory worker's pay, a bit of grocery money quietly tucked away for someone else's cause. These offerings became the lifeblood of a movement that refused to die, no matter how hard the world tried to silence it. It was not charity they gave, but investment in justice, in dignity, in a future they might never live to see. The church's financial power did not come from abundance but from sacrifice. Every dollar carried a story. A grandmother would forgo her Sunday hat so that another mother could post bail for her arrested son. A pastor would delay repairing the leaking roof of the church so the congregation could fund a community meeting hall. A young woman saving for college might contribute half her savings to help a friend pay for legal defense after a protest. These quiet acts of giving formed a hidden economy of compassion, one that sustained not only the logistics of resistance but also the spirit of those involved. From the pulpit, the message was clear. The fight for freedom was not only fought in the streets, but also supported in the pews. Ministers reminded their congregations that giving was a form of service, a tangible way to turn faith into action. They quoted scripture about generosity and stewardship, linking ancient lessons to the urgent needs of the present. We are called to bear one another's burdens, they would say, and the people understood. The collection plate that passed through those pews was not a symbol of obligation, it was a symbol of shared responsibility. These funds built more than buildings. They built networks of survival. When protesters were arrested, it was the church treasury that paid their bail. When families lost income due to strikes or boycotts, church committees organized to deliver food, clothing, and sometimes rent money. In towns where segregation had choked access to education, churches pooled resources to start their own schools or scholarship programs. What little they had, they shared. And through that sharing, they created a system of mutual care that mirrored the freedom they sought. Behind every public act of courage stood these quiet exchanges, envelopes passed discreetly between hands. Meetings held after Sunday service where treasurers counted coins with trembling fingers, aware that every cent represented both hope and risk. There were moments when resources ran thin, when fear whispered that they could not afford to keep giving. But somehow, through faith and determination, the offerings never stopped. For every setback, there was always another service, another song, another round of donations gathered with the same unspoken vow: we will not let this movement falter. The financial support extended beyond bail and legal aid. Churches became incubators for community initiatives that addressed the deeper roots of inequality. They opened small banks, mutual aid societies, and credit unions to help Black families save money, buy homes, and start businesses in an economy designed to exclude them. Women's groups within congregations organized sewing circles, food drives, and literacy classes, using the funds collected to provide materials and support. Every initiative, no matter how small, was built on the same principle that freedom without stability could never last, and that self-sufficiency was the truest expression of liberation. In larger cities, where civil rights organizations began to coordinate national campaigns, the church's financial network provided a foundation of reliability. Movement leaders knew they could count on local pastors to collect funds discreetly and deliver them where they were most needed. It was an economy of trust, maintained not by contracts but by conscience. The church treasurer and the field organizer might never meet in person, but their shared purpose connected them more tightly than any written agreement could. Money collected from these congregations flowed into buses for demonstrations, printing presses for pamphlets, and legal fees for those facing unjust trials. It was also used to rebuild. When churches themselves were damaged or targeted, neighboring congregations stepped forward to contribute to repairs, proving that destruction could never erase unity. The more they gave, the more resilient they became, turning financial hardship into a testament of endurance. This cycle of giving and rebuilding became a sacred rhythm, one that sustained the body of the movement as surely as prayer sustained its soul. Pastors often spoke of the widow's mite, the biblical story of a woman who gave all she had, and drew a parallel to the countless individuals who did the same in their time. The offerings may have been modest, but their collective power was extraordinary. Each coin placed into the plate was a vote of confidence, a declaration that they believed not only in the cause, but in one another. Over time, the church's role as a financial backbone helped transform resistance into a structured, lasting force. Where other institutions wavered or withdrew, the church remained steadfast, quietly underwriting the movement's most critical moments. It provided the unseen scaffolding behind the speeches and marches, the bus fuel, the food, the phone calls, the printing costs, all the invisible labor that made visible change possible. And through every sacrifice, the congregations were not diminished but strengthened. The people learned that giving, when rooted in shared struggle, multiplies rather than divides. Their generosity was not a one-time act, but a way of life, an expression of unity so powerful that it could turn scarcity into abundance. By pooling what little they had, they created something priceless, the assurance that no one stood alone. Thus, the Black Church became not only the moral and spiritual heart of a movement, but also its economic engine, sustaining the dream when everything else seemed to conspire against it. Through open hands and steadfast hearts, they built a legacy of generosity that still echoes in every effort toward justice today, a reminder that real strength is not measured by what one possesses, but by what one is willing to give for the good of all. As the years turned and the fires of struggle gave way to moments of victory and reflection, the Black Church continued to stand not just as a place of worship, but as a living archive of heritage. Within its walls, the echoes of African drums still resonated not literally, but through rhythm, call and response, and the deep emotional cadence of gospel music that flowed from generation to generation. The melodies sung in those sanctuaries were born from pain, but carried in them the indestructible light of endurance. They told stories of ancestors who had once sung in fields and on ships, their songs now reborn in choirs and organs, transformed into hymns of faith, identity, and triumph. In the rise and fall of each note, you could hear history itself breathing the sorrow of bondage, the strength of survival, and the joy of deliverance. Through music and worship, the Black Church bridged continents and centuries, linking ancient African spirituality with the lived experience of a new world. It became a sanctuary where faith met culture, where the act of worship was also an act of remembrance. Each Sunday service was a living ritual not just for salvation, but for the affirmation of existence. Over time, this fusion of spirituality and culture created something uniquely powerful, a shared identity that could not be erased by oppression or time. Even when laws changed and movements evolved, the church remained a symbol of pride, a reminder that history was not just endured but shaped by those who refused to lose their voice. The songs, the sermons, the dance of the Spirit all became threads in the fabric of continuity, weaving together a people who had every reason to forget but chose instead to remember. This continuity gave the community not only strength but also beauty. It transformed grief into grace, struggle into song, and faith into art. The Black Church became a museum of sound, a gallery of resilience, and a theater of hope. In its music were the echoes of the old world and the pulse of the newer rhythm that said, "We are still here." Even today, those rhythms shape modern music, from gospel to blues, from jazz to soul, and onward to hip-hop. What began as prayer became poetry. What began as lament became legacy. As generations passed, the church continued to nurture not only the spirit but also the imagination. It reminded its people that resistance was not only about surviving injustice, but also about preserving joy, laughter, and community. The clap of hands, the stomp of feet, the chorus that rose like a wave, these were not just expressions of faith but celebrations of life itself. Through worship, the church transformed ordinary Sundays into moments of transcendence, moments when history felt alive and tomorrow felt possible. And so, as we look back across time, we see that the Black Church was never just one thing. It was a school when there were none. It was a courtroom when justice was denied. It was a meeting hall when voices needed to be heard. It was a bank, a choir, a shelter, a home all built upon a foundation of faith and love. It carried a people through centuries of trials and triumphs, teaching each generation the same unchanging truth. That dignity, courage, and hope are sacred gifts no one can take away. The story of the Black Church is, in truth, the story of a people who turned faith into action, pain into progress, and memory into movement. It reminds us that history is not written only by those in power, but also by those who gather in humble rooms and sing their truth until the world must listen. As we close this chapter, take a moment to reflect on what these sanctuaries truly represent: not only buildings of brick and wood, but living monuments to the unbroken human spirit. Their songs still rise, their prayers still echo, and their light still shines across generations, guiding us toward understanding, justice, and unity. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, a history not of despair, but of strength, faith, and the power of community. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of resilience and hope, we invite you to continue walking with us through the many untold stories of the past that still shape our present. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story that brings history to life. Your support helps us keep these voices alive, reminding the world that even in the darkest times, faith and unity can light the way forward.